Hello from Singapore. My name is Richa Menke. I'm a Director of Strategic Design at BCG Digital Ventures. And what I spend my days doing is really looking at how we can understand humans better as a means of really building exciting new businesses. And I'm really excited to be here today as part of this festival celebration of cities. And the question I want to pose today is, should cities think like startups? And I'm going to share some of the insights from innovation in the business world, and perhaps there's some insights that might apply to urban innovation. So what do humans, companies, and cities have in common? If you think about it, the human body is fascinating. It's constantly changing. It's changing so much so that basically every 7 years, our body has renewed itself. Cities, interestingly, are also quite similar. They're constantly changing from within. Most of the time when we think of change in cities, we look at migration, net migration and change. But if you look at what's happening inside cities and you study the amount of movement and change in jobs, et cetera, we see that most of the time, most of the renewal is coming from within. And companies, as we know, are living shorter and shorter lives. So all of these, rather than just being things, maybe we can think of them as processes. Processes, they're organic, they're born, they grow, they die. They're constantly changing, and they're constantly in the state of becoming. So what are these forces that companies face? There's this notion of creative destruction, which was introduced in the 1940s by economist Schumpeter. And the idea is that the economy goes through cycles of boom and bust, and new technologies destroy value of older businesses supporting older technologies. And as you can see in this graph, what we see is the music industry turnover, where the channel, the medium with which music is consumed is perpetually changing. And it's a great example of this idea of creative destruction. Now, cities similarly face many, many challenges: climate change, inequality, technology change, governance, et cetera. But what's fascinating about this moment in time is everything has been accelerated to a point that we're still trying to understand what is happening. Who knew that a city's competition could be Zoom? Inner cities, business districts are being hollowed out with the pandemic, working from home, and with all of these changes happening, what insights can we draw from the disruptive forces facing business and how to create value in business as a means of thinking about urban innovation? So as we mentioned, companies are dying quicker than ever before. The lifespan of a corporation is nearly halved in just 3 decades. So what we do at Digital Ventures is really working with these companies, these corporations, to really try to defy the odds. And how we do this is we try to fuse the assets of the corporate business with a startup mindset. So unlike a typical startup, a corporate they have the capital, they have the expertise, they have a consumer base, but the problem is they tend to get in the way. So how can we bring more of an entrepreneurial mindset to really unlock new value? So at the heart of this methodology is really addressing the innovator's dilemma, the idea that successful companies can fail by making the right decisions in the wrong situations. And part of what makes the innovator's dilemma so fascinating is that really it's about balancing many different forces that are at play. Is success ROI, or is success customer feedback, customer retention? Is it more about embracing disruptive ideas, or should it be more about incremental ideas that can deliver value in the short term? Should we think more divergently, convergently? Is it about cost? Is it about quality, stability, change? And very importantly, is it about short-term results or long-term competitiveness? So these are some of the dilemmas that are at play in business. And as we shift our view to urban life, there's some similar dilemmas at play, similar tensions, so stability and change, the notion of place versus developable space, market forces, planning controls, cost, quality, economic value versus cultural value, natural versus unnatural. These are some perennial dilemmas that exist, and the idea isn't that any of these get resolved in the same way that they don't in business, but the idea is to constantly be balancing them and responding to the changing times. So at Digital Ventures, when we evaluate new businesses, what we try to do is really understand all the different dimensions of the opportunity, all the different dimensions of the problem that we're trying to solve. So these are some 4 key questions which I think relate in many, many other contexts, including urban innovation. The first one being, does it matter? Do consumers want this? Does it solve a real friction, a real pain point? And is this the right time? Will it grow? Is there an opportunity for profitability in this? Do we have a viable way to go to market? Will it work? Is the technology enablement feasible? And ultimately, can we win? As a corporate launching a new business, what are those unique assets that a business has? Are we leveraging them? So these are 4 kind of key questions that we evaluate when we look at an investment case for a new business. But as with all systems, you can't optimize for everything at the same time. So the question is, what do you optimize for? As we look at this, I think what's interesting is to start to look at these new businesses that we want to create, which are very much like new startups. What can we learn from them? The reality is most startups are not successful. So what can we learn from successful startups? So if we look at some research into the single biggest reasons why startups succeed and the single biggest reasons why startups fail, there's some really fascinating insights. So Bill Gross of Idea Lab has a great TED Talk where he's done research looking at companies, the hundreds of companies that they've invested in and other investors have invested in. And they look at many different factors. They look at team, uniqueness of the idea. They look at funding, timing, several different factors. And what they find is in that research is that the single greatest determinant of the success of a startup is timing. Timing. What does that really mean? Timing is a reflection that the time has come for an idea. The time has come for a particular value proposition, that it is desirable to consumers. And that's a reflection, I would posit, is a reflection of shifts in values. And another study which looked at why do startups fail, looked at 100 entrepreneurs who were self-reporting the variety of different reasons why they failed. And in this study, what they found is the #1 reasons that startups fail is they don't serve a market need. Now, if we look at these 2 studies, very different methodologies, et cetera, but there's something common here. It's this idea that if you can understand where consumer value lies and how it's shifting to the point of timing, you can create tremendous value. So if we think about consumer values, they're perpetually changing, and it's visible everywhere. What better place to see consumer value than a teenage girl's magazine? And if you look at one version from the 1950s and one from 2015, the first is talking about how to make your own clothes and look great, versus the second one is more about empowerment and how to be your best self. So these shifts in values, if you take a step back and look at where a lot of value is being created, it's a really, really interesting way to view some of these new businesses. So decades ago, the notion of trust between strangers was not something that you would see so visibly. But you look at companies like Airbnb and TripAdvisor that have actually leveraged this emerging value. So with TripAdvisor, suddenly instead of trusting expert reviews, I'd rather trust a stranger's review of a location. Airbnb, rather than staying in a hotel, I would rather have a more authentic experience, and I would rather stay in a stranger's home. The idea of the sharing economy and access, not ownership, was a really important lever in the success and rise of Uber. Other shifts in values, this convenience culture, this time famine that we face where we're always trying to pack the maximum that we can. And some of the businesses that have exploited this shift in values are food delivery, food prep businesses. Another example is, Warby Parker that has disrupted the eyewear industry. But part of the wave that they're riding is this greater appreciation for affordable style, not necessarily buying, the expensive brand, really trying to signal a shift in values by purchasing this direct-to-consumer, well-designed but affordable product. And finally, the incredible rise of plant-based meat substitutes is fascinating because meat substitutes have been around for a very long time. But it seems like the time has come for these because there's this growing awareness around the climate risk and the connectedness that we have, and the idea that every decision that we make also has an impact on climate change has really led to this rise in ethical consumption, and the idea that more and more consumers want to reduce their meat consumption. So what's really, really interesting is that, as we discussed, companies are constantly in the state of becoming, but what's very, very interesting to the point of success is really understanding how the consumer is changing. And another interesting aspect to this is, we've talked about creating consumer value, understanding how their values are changing, but what we're seeing more and more is that it isn't enough just to create a convenient solution for consumers. It isn't enough to give a product that has ethical consumption. Consumers demand more. Consumers are citizens as well, and there's a growing awakening and the growing awareness around the responsibility of capitalism itself. So we see this shift in values, and consumers increasingly expect businesses to really create greater shared value, where it isn't just about a profit motive, but really creating greater value for society at large. So potentially, the next competitive frontier is a version of capitalism that's focused on the long term and the common good. And to this end, at DV and at BCG, we've been looking at this idea of total societal impact. Every company has positive and negative economic, social, and environmental impact. TSI is really a system to measure and assess and really aggregate these different impacts. It isn't the solution, but it's a means of starting to surface and help us understand those impacts before we build new businesses, before we launch new ventures. So the whole total societal impact is built off of the UN SDG goals, but really, again, to this idea of the dilemmas and the balancing, it's also a balancing act. But it's a tool with which we can start to evaluate more than just the human outcome, but truly the societal impact of what we're doing. So this is another dimension that we've increasingly needed to add to our repertoire to really help understand how we can launch successful new businesses. So today we've been talking about how businesses can really defy the odds to build a successful venture. And part of what we've discussed is, we need to understand all the dimensions of the problem. What are all the dilemmas that exist? We need to think about value creation as something that lies in the hands of consumers. So we need to understand humans. We need to understand our total impact on society. And really, ultimately, this idea that consumers are citizens too. So to return to the first question of should cities think like startups? What we see is that, the business world is perpetually changing. It's in the constant state of becoming. So if a startup is essentially a new business that's trying to create some new value. And so invariably, they are emergent. They're iterating. They're constantly trying to get that product market fit. And that iteration, experimental approach of trying to find value, I think, is great inspiration for some of the challenges faced in the urban context as cities try to explore new ways of creating value for their people. And ultimately, what we find is, a business, ultimately a new business, is about creating a new customer. Cities are ultimately built for people. If we want to create value, we really need to understand how those values are changing. And perhaps a very simple way to start to think about that, if we have greater empathy for our customers, if we have greater empathy for our citizens, greater empathy for our employees, et cetera, perhaps we can find new ways to unlock new value. Thank you very much.
Hello from Singapore. I'm Stacie Chan. I'm a Global Product Partnerships Manager at Google Asia Pacific, and I have the wonderful job of getting to work externally with many companies from all sorts of industries to make sure that anytime you're using a Google product, it is the most locally relevant experience you can get. And I'm so excited to be here talking today with my good friend Richa, and I have a lot of follow-up questions for her. Richa, your presentation was fantastic, by the way. As someone who's not an expert on urbanization, I had many, many questions. The first of which was when you were talking about how consumers for businesses are actually citizens for cities. But I want to unpack how you think cities should be defining citizens, especially as you mentioned earlier in the presentation, human beings are fickle. They're constantly changing every 7 years. They're literally reinventing themselves from their taste buds changing every 7 years. So how should cities be thinking about their citizens who are more transient than ever?
Thanks, Stacie. That's a great question. You know, as with many things with cities, I think it's complex. If you think about it, you know, city is the system that's constantly changing. So who the actual customer is and who you're targeting is constantly changing. And I think, you know, perhaps the best way to think about it is that really the culture of a city is really the greatest filter, you know, that will attract certain people and not attract other people. So in many ways, you could think about how a city can think about how it manifests the values of that city. And, you know, an example here locally in Singapore, which I have always loved is, you know, for example, when you take the MRT, the sign, for example, for an emergency exit, et cetera, is in multiple languages. It's a small thing, something you may not notice, you get used to, but it's a very powerful symbol of championing multiculturalism and inclusivity. And it's a very small symbol, but as with most things, it's what you do that matters rather than what you say. So I think it's really interesting little example of how cities can be more focused on how they respect, manifest, and celebrate the values of that city.
Absolutely, and I think for both of us as residents of Singapore, we love it here. We can see why people tend to move here. Year on year, there is a steady growth in population. And as a Google employee, and I think this is a growth measurement that many technology companies use as a factor of success, in that we want to grow our user base. But by comparison, should cities be looking at growth as an absolute metric of success? Should they be looking at population growth as a sign that, yes, we're doing well, or are there other success metrics by which they should be measuring themselves?
I had the same question as you, what I came across was super interesting. Is that a study done by Imperial College where they were looking at, you know, exactly this idea, like, is it the actual sheer volume of people that creates the greatest output of a city? And what they found in their study is that it's actually the number of connections that people have is a greater determinant of the success of a city rather than the sheer number. And the way they did this is they looked at some open source data around the number of citizens in a certain location and then looked at the output. And really this research is meant to inform decisions that cities are making, because cities are great facilitators of those interactions. If you think about public transportation, parks, you know, all sorts of opportunities to create those interactions between citizens, to create that serendipity. But I found this fascinating that perhaps rather than focusing on the number of people or the type of people, rather a way to think about vitality of a city is to think about how we can really facilitate maximum interactions between citizens and residents.
I love the word that you used, vitality. I think now that we're all in a global pandemic, I think not only has the ethos and the general sentiment of cities sombered up a bit, we don't have the water cooler. We don't have the town square to celebrate physical events in the way that we used to. So how should cities be looking at ways to celebrate their unique culture, to still foster and build those connections when there are limitations on the number of groups, the number of people in groups that we can hang out with, and the limited physical interactions that we now can have? And you mentioned that Zoom is sort of a, I guess, frenemy, a competitor, but also a way to facilitate interactions. So how should cities be looking at fostering that vitality, but also looking at other technological companies that can be aiding this vitality?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I think there's lots of amazing examples of cities that have risen to the challenge. And just anecdotally, one example that I found really fascinating is the way Taiwan has approached the pandemic. They have a bunch of open source data, which was used by developers to actually create value during the pandemic. Simple example was, pandemic started, there was a mad rush for masks. And so you can imagine there's, this fear of not being able to get a mask. So these citizens intervened, used this open source data, and actually created a view where you could see live where the stock was available, and really using technology for good, which I personally found a very inspiring example of, cities, partnering with other people to actually create that value and embracing technology.
You touched upon the P word, which I hold near and dear to my heart since partnerships is the job that I do. And I've been super fortunate to be able to work with the Singaporean government because similar to Taiwan, they also have a lot of open source data. I participated in a few hackathons that Workforce Singapore has done in order to increase employment, try to facilitate jobs for some underrepresented populations in Singapore. And what they offer in opening up that data is working with technology companies to say, here is our employment data, Google, LinkedIn, Indeed. What can you build to help our citizens find more employment? And so we actually launched a product here in Singapore because we did some back of the napkin stats saying 50% of people globally, we don't publicly break down those numbers by country, but 50% of people will start their job search on Google. So how can we, leveraging the Singapore government's open data, create a better experience for people looking for jobs on Google? I love that private-public partnership. And so what would be your advice or recommendation for cities to proactively seek out partnerships with private technology companies?
I mean, first of all, it's just acknowledging that we're all part of this system and that, cities are not alone. And, cities are a great platform for enterprise. So, it's really a common shared value, in terms of coming together. I personally find the idea of open source really interesting because it allows for emergence. The idea that, who's to say that, with all due respect, Google and LinkedIn are the best places to solve the problem versus, somebody else, another developer who's very passionate about a topic, right? So I think, that spirit of being open source, I think, that aspect of being emergent, with the combination of these very strategic partnerships as you shared, I think that sort of approach would allow ideas to emerge and more strategic ones to be resolved through those partnerships. So, potentially both, bottom up and top down way to approach that.
And then I think the challenge with partnerships, to your point, Richa, is not only identifying whom you should partner with, but what is the right timing. And you really stressed that point in your presentation on that being the key factor in making startups successful. So timing to me feels a lot like identifying the right opportunity plus action. And so I do not use the word luck because it really is timing. But how should cities strapped for resources and supposed to be the end-all be-all for so many expectations of their residents, how are they supposed to still keep their eyes and ears to the ground to make sure they're not missing opportunities and seizing them at the right point in time?
Really important question. And I think this is part of what I was attempting to do to reframe the idea of timing as really focusing on those consumer values. Timing, as you say, sounds a lot like luck. But, in terms of human-centered design, one of the most fundamental ideas is to start with empathy, not to start with the solution. So if we can, be open-minded, be empathetic, really try to understand who our target customers are, really understand, their frictions, their latent needs, what drives them, what motivates them, really understand what would be desirable for them. That's a great process by which to discover how to create value. So I would reframe the timing point, which, as you say, is really hard to harness. But I think this idea of really focusing on the need as the starting point, I think is important. And if you look at the current, incredible moment in history that we're in, I mean, it's a great example of, things are changing so fast. You could argue that the pandemic has been an accelerant of many existing trends. And it's revealing many interesting things about ourselves. One of the things we were discussing before is that in some ways the pandemic has really revealed a lot of the systemic inequality that exists, in many different societies. And also here in Singapore, what we just, the very different experience for a certain part of the population, the migrant workers, was something that was considered unacceptable. Ultimately, PM Lee saying that we can do better. So we have this incredible moment in time. It's revealing something that maybe we should be better at, but it's also an opportunity to change. And I think given that things are in flux, it's such a great opportunity for cities to really think more like startups, experiment, try to find that product market fit. And really try new things, because I think there's a greater appetite now given the rate of change around us. So, it's a great opportunity to try thinking like that.
I love the point that you mentioned about the opportunity to reduce inequality. Unfortunately, in a lot of countries, the pandemic has exposed and actually further driven a wedge in that inequality. But I do believe that digitization of services actually provides greater access to some of these services. Something that I have been working on with Google is our flood forecasting initiative with the governments of Bangladesh and India. And we now have provided algorithmic models on data that they send to us so we can accurately predict up to 26 hours before a flood happens. On the ground, we will send alerts to people's phones to say, evacuate now, there's going to be flooding happening. And that provides equal access to anyone. It doesn't matter how rich or poor, what region you live in. We want to make sure that everyone has access to this information. But I think there's also a potential to further increase the inequality for people who do have smartphones and can receive those alerts versus those who don't have smartphones. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how much cities should be thinking about digitization or putting their services online for the sake of digitization, or when cities should think that this actually is the most impactful. For example, we've chatted very much with the Singapore government to decide when a chatbot is the most effective way to communicate with residents, or whether or not all applications should be submitted online for your work visa. So how should cities be thinking about when technology is appropriate, or that the way they're currently doing things in a more analog manner is actually the most effective way to communicate with their residents?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think at the end of the day, technology is it's an enabler. And I think, again, if we would take the view of, what type of value we want to create, it's really, again, understanding what matters. So, if it's a routine submission of some information for government purposes, potentially efficiency is what I want to optimize for, and a digital channel may be the most efficient, and even if it's impersonal, it's fine. Versus, if it is a different scenario where I might have greater anxiety, maybe it's regarding medical records, et cetera, potentially something that's so impersonal may not be the best experience. And again, I think cities can iterate, experiment, and try to figure out what's important. In that scenario, it may be important. Some aspects, for example, document collection could be done very efficiently using technology, but potentially, walking somebody through the process is best done by another human being who can, who has a greater chance of inspiring trust, allaying someone's fears. So, it really depends on what exactly we're trying to achieve and how we think about value in that context.
Definitely. And I know BCG Digital Ventures is so disciplined and rigorous about measuring experiments. Similarly, for technology companies, we're constantly A/B testing. We're running experiments all the time because we want to make sure we're maximizing value. At the end of the day, what are some of the KPIs or key performance indicators that you're using for your clients that you think could really be effective and translate also to how cities should be thinking about providing the most value for their residents?
Yeah, KPIs are a very frequent topic. I think that the first thing with KPIs is they're great indicators, but they are not the end in itself. And I think part of what I shared today around the way we look at an investment case, this is defining several different lenses into success from different perspectives. From a desirability perspective, is this a real friction? What is the size of the friction? From viability perspective, it's really about, do we have a real business case here? Can we really create value, monetary value? When we look at feasibility, it's looking at our ability to scale. And then again, looking at how we can take some of the unfair advantage that some of these corporates have and leverage that. So those are a collection of different lenses, and along with them are different metrics that we can look at. Similarly with the total societal impact. And again, I think it comes back to a bit of this balancing act. There isn't a single metric in every scenario that is meaningful. Again, I think it's about how we think about the way we're creating value, but still always evaluating from these different lenses. I think that's the important piece. So having really diverse KPIs so you don't miss something.
And your comparison between cities and startups is fascinating, because I do think both cities and startups need to have these KPIs, but they're working on very different timelines. 95% of startups, unfortunately, will not survive to see their next year. And so they're thinking of much more short-term goals, trying to secure the next round of funding. Cities, for the most part, have to think about longevity. They're probably going to be around for decades, we hope. So when you're advising your clients in terms of timelines and how to measure success, the 1-year, 5-year, 10-year plan, but also balancing that with being flexible. We do not anticipate COVID-19 happening. So that 10-year plan that a city may have had to go completely out the window. For Google, when we were building our products, we thought we knew what our 2020 plan was going to be. We absolutely had to build a new coronavirus search results page, as we call it, from scratch, because no one had ever searched for the term coronavirus. So how should cities be balancing these long-term timelines, planning for the future, the retirement of many of their residents, but still also have the flexibility to be accountable when a natural disaster or something as unfortunate as a global pandemic happens? How do you balance the two?
Yeah, again, a really great dilemma, I think, faced both in business and cities. And to be clear, I don't think that things are necessarily resolved in the business world either. It's a constant conversation about, this emerging idea of capitalism should be around about the shared value in this longer term perspective. I think it's interesting to kind of balance both. I think when we're launching a new venture, these are short-term experiments where we can de-risk and test our hypotheses. And the idea is the sooner we fail, the sooner we learn. So it's similar to a startup mindset, the greater the chances of success in the long term as well. So they're interconnected. I think in the same way as the city, as you say, nobody expected the pandemic, but it's a great opportunity to actually experiment because we don't have a choice. Nobody really has the answer, but it's a great opportunity, and it's the only way to make sure that they do survive in the long term. Doing nothing right now is unlikely to be the most successful route. So I don't think that cities really have a choice, and I think it's happening. It's a system that's emergent that's going to optimize itself for that longer term value, I think. But I think it's having that strategic longer term view about where we want to go, but balancing that with the shorter term experiments and tests and kind of litmus tests of, are we heading in the right direction?
And in that regard, I actually think cities may be a bit more like corporations, in that corporations, especially public companies, have a lot more stakeholders. If they're public, they need to be accountable to their shareholders. Cities cannot fail as fantastically as startups can, because they need to keep the lights on. They literally need to make sure the water is running. They need to make sure that the trash is picked up. So where do you think the sweet spot is for cities to be able to experiment without failing too much and letting down residents versus having that gusto or courage to try radical things to make sure that they're constantly innovating. And I think the Singaporean government does that because they're constantly innovating. They attract the best and brightest talent. And how can other cities replicate this courage to fail and try, but not too much to ultimately damage the livelihood and the culture of their city?
Yeah. Well, I think, failure is all around us as well, right? I mean, I think there's successes and failures, and it's just that process of regeneration. I think what I find very powerful in this kind of approach that, for example, we take and many of the companies do in terms of building new businesses is that we might have a big, bold vision, but we think about what's the minimum viable product. Like, where do we start? Like, what's the first thing we need to test? What's the best indicator that there is that we can actually deliver on that bigger, grander vision? So I think, that approach to, launching smaller versions and testing and iterating is really the way to do it. And I think, in the case of Singapore, I'm sure that, before they launch any big new initiative, they're testing it in smaller audiences and using similar tools that we might do. So I think, success is just part of the process. Success and failure are just part of the process. Like, I think there's no way around it. But I think there's power in trying. And there could not be a better moment in time to do this than now, where cities are facing, unemployment, all sorts of different challenges and inequality. This is the best moment in time to actually start trying.
Absolutely. And I think the status quo for many cities is to be slightly risk averse or more conservative. But I want to see if there's any last piece of advice or recommendations you have for cities that you have brought in your years of experience.
Well, I think maybe, to what we've discussed, I think having, in the same way that, many of these bigger corporations that we work with, they're very aware of the strengths that they have, but they're also aware of some of the weaknesses that they have. And, how can cities think about their strengths, but marry that with more of an iterative, emergent mindset of a startup, and try to find new ways to actually create value. So I think it's a mix between the corporate and the startup mindset that potentially can carry over to the idea of urban innovation.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Richa.
Thank you.
I've had a blast picking the brilliant brain of my good friend Richa, but I know we also have a fantastic lineup of other speakers at the festival, so we hope that you enjoy the rest of the talks for the remainder of the festival. Thank you so much.
Thank you.